with me today is Sarah Reed. She is our Chief of Staff and kind of makes sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're supposed to do it. My name is Matthew Orr. I'm the founder, owner, and chief architect for VoIPTools. And I'll be kind of walking you through our discussion today. Let's talk a little bit quickly about what we're going to cover in this webinar. I got a bunch of bullet points here, but don't panic. These are 1 to 2 minute sections of the discussion. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of talk about what is the relay and how does it fit into the VoIPTools architecture. Then I'm going to show you pathetically simple 2 settings that are necessary to secure your relay. Then we'll talk about some more advanced topics about security to make it even more secure. Then we'll talk about some new security features coming in the next release of the relay, and that'll be it's actually in production in a lot of places already. So we'll talk about some of the new security features that will be available with that, with the broader release of the next version of the relay. And then I'll walk you through the actual installation and configuration of the relay from start to finish. It will be the Windows version. All right, so this is the 3CX server, and let's talk a little bit about what happens in that 3CX server. There we go. All right, so obviously on the 3CX server, you're going to install the 3CX phone system. And for the purposes of this discussion, there's really 2 components of the 3CX phone system that apply to what we're talking about. That's the 3CX call control API. This is how we communicate with the 3CX server, and the 3CX call flow designer. Both of those are components of the 3CX phone system. On this same server, the 3CX server, you will also install our relay. And this relay has 2 important components, and that's the REST API and the Events API. And it is through these APIs that our applications communicate with the 3CX server. So the relay then, in turn, forwards any requests that our relay receives to the 3CX phone system to the call control API. Conversely, the call flow designer can make requests of our VoIPTools relay and get information that wouldn't normally be accessible through the call flow designer. I should also point out that the relay is compatible with both the Windows version and the Linux version of 3CX. So we have a version for both platforms. All right, now you'll notice that one of the things that you don't see on the 3CX server are the rest of our tools: recording manager, voicemail manager, dialers, wallboards, those kinds of things. Those kinds of things are installed on a separate server that, for the context of this discussion, we'll call the VoIPTools server. And on that server, you typically will have a copy of SQL Server installed. Usually the free Express version of SQL Server is sufficient, and we'll install Internet Information Server. That's the web server that presents the user interface to our web applications. Then we'll install our actual tools directly on this server. So this is Voicemail Manager, Wallboards, and other tools. And if we've created any custom development tools for you or your customers, those would be installed on the 3CX server. The goal here is to minimize what's installed on the 3CX server and to move all of the processing and databases and those kinds of things on a separate server so that we don't impact the 3CX server in any way. So how do these 2 guys talk together? Well, we can communicate with each other from anywhere to anywhere, provided that they can see each other and communicate over HTTPS. That means that your 3CX server can be in the cloud, hosted on Amazon, and this VoIPTools server can be installed somewhere in the cloud or even on-prem. As long as they can see each other, then they can communicate over HTTPS, so an encrypted connection. In the coming versions that are in use now but haven't been widely publicly made available, it will also layer on top of this security that we're going to talk about, the JWT authorization component. So this is kind of the architecture and where the VoIPTools relay fits into this whole discussion about security. All right, so 2 steps to secure the relay. And I could go to this next screen and say, oh, this is how you do it, and we'd be done. But we want to encrypt all the communication between those 2 servers, and we want to restrict who can communicate with that relay down to 1 IP address, and that's the IP address of the VoIPTools server. In that way, by restricting access to the relay by IP address, we ensure that anybody trying to get unauthorized access to the relay is going to have their requests automatically rejected, because they're going to come from an IP address that we didn't authorize, right? So how do you do that? It's really quite pathetically simple. For those of you who have worked with the relay before, you'll recognize this configuration screen. And so all we need to do is look at the 2 red circles in this picture. The first one is make sure that the only binding on your server is HTTPS. So by default, when you install the relay, it's going to have both HTTP and HTTPS. You want to restrict that down to only HTTPS and port 8801. The second step is the other red circle, and that's putting in the IP address of your VoIPTools server. This is how you lock down the relay so that if it gets requests from any other IP address, it's just going to reject those requests. So this would typically be the public IP of your VoIPTools server if your 3CX server is hosted in the cloud. But if both your 3CX server and your VoIPTools server are in your internal network hosted on-prem, then this would more typically be the private IP address of your VoIPTools server. Now, there's no restriction to the number of IP addresses that you put in here. So if you want to be able to get access to the relay from a couple of select administrators' PCs, you could add more allowed IP addresses here. Just understand that the more devices that you allow to communicate with the relay, the greater the service attack area is. So we do want to keep these down to a minimum number of IP addresses, ideally just the VoIPTools server. And then if you need to access the relay, you could log into the VoIPTools server and then browse to the 3CX server from there. And then you just need that 1 IP address. Okay, so those are the basic settings. You could do these 2 settings in the matter of 1 minute and be done, and your relay is going to be very, very tightly locked down, and nobody's going to be able to do unauthorized communications with that server. All right, so what's next? Let's talk about a best practice. I have always been a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of putting your 3CX server right out on the internet and then blocking access to various ports using the firewall that resides on the same server as the PBX. I think it's a best practice that you have a firewall that is on as is either a physical device that is separate from your server, but this would be your perimeter firewall. And there's 10,000 different firewalls out there, so I'm not going to be able to show you how to set this up on your perimeter firewall So I'm going to take this very simple example. This is a screenshot from Amazon Light Sale, which is probably the least expensive place that you could install your 3CX server. And the process of doing this same restriction that I showed you just a minute ago, how to do in the relay, you can do this in the Light Sale firewall that's protecting the 3CX server. So just go in there, you specify a custom application, specify TCP IP, select 8801, and then check that checkbox, restrict to IP address. And then this is where you would put in the address of the 3CX server. So I think as a best practice, sure, go ahead, put it in the VoIPTools relay and block it there. You could also block it in the Windows firewall, and you could also block it in your perimeter firewall. So my opinion is let's get these people blocked long before they even get to your 3CX server. Okay, so what's coming? So this is a screen capture of the next relay. Looks a lot like the other one. I have reorganized some of the settings to have all of the security settings at the very top. So again, that first section, just make sure that it's HTTPS. The second section, put in the allowed IP addresses. Those obviously have to be static IP addresses, by the way. If you're using dynamic IP addresses, you'd then have to go in and update these IP addresses all the time, and that'd be no fun. But what I wanted to show you in this screen now is this next section that's in red. And this is where our JWT authorization process works. So the idea behind JWT is that the client application, that's going to be the VoIPTools server running recording manager, wallboards, dialers, those kinds of things. Those applications will have a public key and a private key, and they will match a public key and a private key that's implemented on the relay, this screen being the example. And when these two applications want to communicate with each other, the client application, let's say Recording Manager, for example, will send an authorization request to the relay, and it'll include that public key. And the relay will compare that public key and the hash information that's in there and determine, yeah, this is a real person. He's got the appropriate keys. I'll give him a token. And now that application, whenever it wants to communicate with the relay, it has to submit with the request the token that was provided by the 3CX server. To further secure this whole process, that token has an expiration date. So you can set it to whatever you want, but by default, it's about 15 minutes. So even if somebody were going to be able, by some miracle, was able to get access to all of this communication stuff, it's going to change every 15 minutes. So this is going to really further lock down the relay. In truth, I think this is perhaps a little bit of overkill since we've already locked down the relay quite a bit. But this is just one more step that we could take to just try and make this whole communication process as secure as possible. So that's what JWT is. We've got this in production with a number of customers already. What you'll see in the coming days and over the next couple of weeks is new releases of the relay and our tools that include JWT. Here's our challenge as a development company, and that is that in order to support JWT, all the applications involved in this process have to support JWT. You can't have some applications using JWT and some not. So as we release more of our tools supporting JWT, it'll be more and more feasible for you to start implementing JWT. So for those customers that just need Recording Manager and a wallboard, provided that both of those applications have JWT on it, then at that time they can turn JWT on and have this additional security. We hope to have all of our tools updated and released to support JWT over the next 20 days or so, 20 working days. So this is going to happen really quickly. As I said, we started this whole JWT process about 2 years ago, and it's just taken us this long to get all the JWT stuff implemented into our various tools. So that's what's going on here. Okay, so that's what's coming down the pike. The next step is to kind of walk you through the installation from start to finish, because there are some little quirkiness steps to this whole process. And I know people have been asking for a video on how to install the relay for a long time, and I'm just getting around to it now. So if you're interested in the security stuff and you're comfortable with installing the relay and making these configuration changes that we've been talking about, feel free to drop off. Otherwise, I'll just continue with the demo, and feel free to hang in there as long as you want. Okay, so the first step will be to go to our website. You'll see up here in the corner, we've got VoIPTools.com. So that's where you're going to navigate to. Then you're going to go to the product screen and download the relay. So let's go ahead and get started here. And this is a pre-recorded video that I did for the installation process so that I could speed up some of the longer steps so that you don't have to sit there watching the hourglass spin. So we're going to come down here to our download page, select the Windows version of our relay. It's going to download a zip file, and that zip file will be installed on your machine. So you want to do this from the 3CX server running. This is the Windows version. The process is a little different for Linux. So you're going to extract this zip file to your local hard drive. Don't try and do this from a network share. You need to make sure that that install folder is local to the machine where you're installing the relay. Find this relay service installer exe. The icons will make it easy for you. The orange icons will make it easy for you to identify the right file. Click on that guy and let it get started. So I've just closed some of the background stuff to simplify the screen here. And then just let it go. You'll see that this is really just a click-through process of saying, yeah, go ahead, get started. It'll do all its thing. It'll set up all of the necessary minimum settings and start up that web server. And then you'll have access to the web front end of the relay. So once you've completed the install, just click on the Start Application. It'll open your browser. And then you log in with your let's see if I can get this guy to pause. There we go. You'll log in with your 3CX administrative credentials. And I should point out that if you haven't already configured all of your administrative users with a complex password, that's absolutely the first thing you should do when securing this whole communication thing, because we don't want it to be a simple password that somebody with a password cracker could just get in there and quickly figure out what your admin password is. So first step is to go into the 3CX server and implement complex passwords. Then when you get to the login screen of the relay, you're going to put in those admin credentials. They'll get verified, and then you can log in. On this screen, you would put in your 3CX license information and then click the register button. I'm not going to go through that process. It's pretty straightforward. License key, name, address, telephone number. And then this is where you're going to remove that HTTP section and only leave the HTTPS stuff. And then you have to click the restart button. And this will tell the relay, okay, now you only respond to HTTPS. That means in order to reconnect, you're going to have to change your URL to be HTTPS, and you're going to need to change that port number to 8100. Once you do that, then you should be able to log right back into the relay. Again, your administrative credentials are in the 3CX server itself. So just put in those credentials and log in. All right. So again, going back to the settings, the next step is to do that filtering. So you're going to add a new IP address. This is the IP address of your VoIPTools server. It would be either the public or private, depending on where your 3CX server is in relation to your VoIPTools server. And then again, you're going to need to restart the application. And this time, because we already started from the perspective of HTTPS, you should be able to reload the screen and get into the relay. I do want to point out one thing, though, and that is that while we have put in a restriction that says only one IP address is allowed to communicate with the relay, we do also allow local hosts. So physical security to that computer is going to be important, that you make sure that only authorized people have access to that virtual machine, because we do allow local host to log into the relay in spite of any restrictions that you put in this restriction section. So just be aware of that local security on the 3CX server is important. All right, so that's really all there is to securing the relay. But since we're here, let's just take a minute to look at a couple of other things for those of you that are kind of new to the relay. You can also set the relay up to automatic update, and you can go here and look at logs and see any errors and anything that shows up. So this is a good place to look if something's not working the way you'd expect. You can go and take a look in the log here for any errors. So you'll see there's a couple of errors in this log. That's because, well, we didn't register the, it was just noting that the relay hasn't been registered yet. In addition to that, we also have access to the API documentation. So the relay, and this is the guide that we're trying to secure, right? This is the one that this whole effort is about. We have a REST-based API built into the relay that allows our remotely installed applications to communicate through the internet to the 3CX server. And there are literally hundreds of APIs that we've created for doing all kinds of things like making calls and creating extensions and inbound rules and adding people to queues and getting the presence status of an extension and real-time events like what are the active calls going on right now. This is all stuff that's built into our APIs. And one of the cool features of our documentation is that you can go in and you can look at what the expected parameters are and actually try out those APIs right from within the documentation. We also, I don't know why they chose to call this an API. It really isn't. For those who are using call flow designer applications, and those call flow designer applications need to access a SQL server, this is simply a place where you can paste in your connection string to your SQL server or to your SQL server and test the connection to make sure that the call flow designer applications can communicate through your network to the SQL server. Keep in mind, for example, that remember, SQL Server is installed on the VoIPTools server, and the relay and call control API and call flow designer are installed on a completely separate server on the 3CX server. So if you want these two, the database and the call flow designer, to be able to talk to a SQL server, then you need to make sure that you've configured SQL Server correctly to allow for remote connections. And this is just a simple way of doing a quick test to see if all of that communication has been set up correctly so the call flow designer can communicate with a SQL database. I will say that as a best practice, you don't really want your call flow designer application to communicate directly with your backend database. The best practice would be to create an API that front ends your database and have your call flow designer call that API that you've created. And in that way, you're not exposing your database server to any other servers than what you intend. All right, but that's what this guy's
about. We do have a question.
Okay, cool. Ask away.
How does the relay need to set up for a 3CX failover scenario? And then there's a link if you could go into the questions.
Yeah, so he's just giving you an example. So in a failover scenario, you would install the relay on both your primary and your secondary 3CX servers. If you get into a failover scenario, then things get a little bit complicated with our tools, in that our tools are configured to specifically talk to an IP address. So if you're swapping the FQDN between those two servers, then our applications will work just fine. Remember, we're not installing anything on the 3CX server. So all of our databases, archived recordings, all of those things continue to reside on the VoIPTools server. So in that scenario, if you've got a failover server and you want to use our applications with both servers, we'll give you a Grace login so that you can register that relay on both servers. Hopefully I've answered that question. I would probably be the best person to talk to if you want to get things configured and working in that scenario. That's a little bit outside the scope of what our support team normally gets involved with, but we can make it work for you. That should be possible. The next and last piece that I wanted to show you was the events API. And what you'll see here is that we've created some tools to help you use our APIs to develop your own applications. So if you've got internal developers that are .NET developers, they can use some of these helper tools that we've created so that they don't need to know the intricacies of how to interact with the 3CX call control API, or even know how to communicate through a REST API. They just make a function call and pass in the parameters, and they don't care about how all the security stuff happens, all the JWT stuff, all that gets implemented behind the scenes. You just do something like get extension list, and it'll return to you a list of extension objects. And how that happened, you don't know and you don't care. So it makes it super easy to build your own tools. And so that's what that first download icon is about, is some helper DLLs that you can incorporate into your application. And then the last one is a full sample Visual Studio application that shows you how to do this whole process end to end. So it should be instructive for those people who are developers. But really, this is kind of what we wanted to cover today in this meeting. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can get us by email, by live chat, by phone. We've got support staff available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you have any security questions, if you have any API questions, if you just want to know more about our tools, feel free to reach out to us. We've got a whole team of guys and gals available to answer your questions.